Hey, a number of years ago, we decided to plant a garden. You ever done that? We decided to plant this garden because we thought it would be great to have fresh vegetables right out of our own garden. And we also thought that it would give us an opportunity as a family to spend time together, using the garden to kind of spend time together. And so we planted this garden, and we learned a few things from planting our garden. And maybe you've had this experience, so you can kind of, relate to some of these things. But we learned that it really isn't the family bonding experience that we had anticipated it was going to be. Nobody likes to pull weeds. And somehow people began to miss their rotation on watering and all the other good things that go along with it. And somehow it ended up on mom and dad to do all the work. So it really wasn't that family bonding experience that we thought. We also learned in the process of our gardening that it's very hard to grow a garden in Kauai. We discovered every bug that lives in Kauai, I think, and probably extras that came just because they heard we were planting a garden and they wanted to be there. It's very difficult to grow a garden in Kauai. And we learned that the vegetables that you grow yourself really do taste better than the vegetables in the store. You understand that, right? That's proven fact. And we discovered that that was true ourselves because it just is true. Fake news, but true. And we learned that what you plant is what you should expect to harvest. We learned that when you plant tomatoes, you should plan on getting tomatoes, not corn. If you plant radishes, you should plan on getting radishes and not sweet peppers. We learned that what you plant is what you should expect to harvest. Now that's a basic reality of farming or gardening. It's basic reality of planting, right? We call it planting and reaping. But it's also a basic reality of life. And the Bible is full of this principle of harvesting what you plant. And in our walk through this book of Judges, we've come to a story this morning that is really full of this idea of harvesting what you plant. It's the story of a guy named Abimelech. And maybe some of you have read ahead and read chapter 9, and you read it and you were like, what is going on here? And I hope by the end of our time together this morning, you won't wonder anymore what's going on here. You'll understand, at least from the standpoint of this idea of harvesting what you plant. Because today we're going to look at chapter 9, and we're going to eventually, after we go through the story, see two warnings related to the principle of harvesting what you plant. So let's jump into it right away, because this is quite a long chapter. And before we get into the chapter, we need to review real quick what we saw in the life of Gideon. And you remember last week we ended the story of Gideon. Gideon was this guy that God chooses to be a judge to deliver Israel. And if you remember the story, whether you were here or you've read it before, Gideon is a fearful man. He's not a courageous guy. He's not a mighty warrior. He's not somebody that you would think, oh yeah, I understand why God chose him. He's got it all together. He wasn't that kind of guy at all. He was a very fearful man. In fact, we see the word afraid a number of times in the chapters describing his life. And that describes him, a fearful man. But God took this fearful guy and he moved him from a place of fear to a place of faith through a variety of experiences. It took a little bit of time, and it took several little instances for God to work with him and be patient with him, but God brought him from a place where he was fearful to a place where he was believing that God could really use him. In fact, the great thing that Gideon did in his life, really about the only great thing that we know about that he did in his life, is he believed God to a point that he took 300 men and conquered an army of literally over 150,000 men. 300 men with nothing more than clay pots, torches, and horns. And God used him to conquer this entire army. Well, what we discovered from there is that instead of staying in that place of strong faith and believing God and following him, he goes from being a guy of fear to a guy of faith to eventually being a guy of tremendous failure. He didn't stay there. Something happened along the way in his journey of faith and being used by God. He becomes very revengeful. He becomes very prideful. He becomes a person that is saying that he won't take the position of king, but he decides to live like a king. And we saw last week he collects gold from the people, royal garb. He ends up having all these wives, ends up having 70 sons. He even has a foreign concubine and a son by that woman. And he names this son by this concubine Abimelech. And if you remember, the name itself means, my father is king. And so Gideon all of a sudden becomes this guy of pride and desire to have, and he ends up not finishing well at all. And at the end of chapter 8, verse 27, we read this. Gideon made a sacred ephod from the gold, and he put it in Ophrah, his hometown. But soon all the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a trap for Gideon and his family. Now, again, that word prostituting itself, it's kind of graphic, but it describes exactly where Israel was in their journey with God. We're calling this series a series about faithfulness. The only thing that we can count on Israel being is faithfully unfaithful. They prostituted themselves. They became unfaithful in their relationship with God over and over again. And Gideon, the guy that God raises up to lead them away from these people who had been leading them into idolatry, ends up leading them right back into idolatry. And so he really finishes life kind of on a down note. He ends up, instead of finishing life victoriously, he ends up in a spiritual failure. Well, last week I told you that was the end of Gideon's story. And it was, specifically. But it really isn't indirectly. Because the story that we're looking at today is about this son, Abimelech. The son that was born to the concubine. You go, well, I'm not really sure what a concubine is. A concubine wasn't a true wife. Think of mistress with a few more perks. And that's kind of what a concubine was. This woman didn't even live in the same town that Gideon lived in. She lived in this place called Shechem. And she probably was a Canaanite woman. She wasn't even an Israelite. Remember, we saw back in chapter 2, one of the things that Israel was supposed to do when they went into the land, they were supposed to kick the people out of the land. They didn't do that. And not only did they not kick them out, they ended up just settling down with them and marrying them. And we have Gideon having this concubine, having this son. He names Abimelech, my father is king. And that's what chapter 9 is about, this guy's life. Now, before we get into it, just a couple little side notes, because I know some of you are interested in this kind of stuff. Because I am, and it's kind of crazy, but you like the little tidbits. So here's a couple of tidbits. This is the longest chapter in Judges. There's 57 verses in this chapter, and we're not going to read them all today, I promise you. But I encourage you to read them all, because it's a great chapter, but it's also a very distressing chapter. It's a depressing chapter. Abimelech, up to this point, everybody that we've seen in Judges has been a judge. Abimelech is not a judge. He is the son of a judge who becomes a king. And he doesn't become king of all of Israel. He becomes king of part of Israel, a section. So that's why he's not considered Israel's first king. Saul would be considered Israel's first king because he was king over all of Israel. Abimelech just had kind of a little territory. But he's not a judge. And this is the first guy in Judges that we're going to look at this carefully that isn't actually a judge. And in Abimelech's story, there's no foreign oppressor. Up to this point, Israel keeps being overtaken by these foreign oppressors, and they need a rescuer or a judge to get them out. No foreign oppressor in this story. The oppression comes from within Israel, which is another interesting thing because it demonstrates how far Israel has digressed in their walk with God. And just to kind of give you a perspective on where we're at in history, at this point in history, we're about 150 years past Joshua. So Joshua's been dead now 150 years. And remember, Joshua, if you've been with us, you remember at the end of Joshua, he's about ready to die. The people in their land, they haven't scattered yet, but Joshua wants to give them a charge. And he says, man, if you will follow God, and if you will believe God, he's going to give you the rest of this land. And if you will obey him, you will prosper and you will be blessed. And he said, but I don't think you're going to do it. But the people say, no, we will, Joshua. And 3 different times during that charge that Joshua gives, the people says, we're going to do it. We're going to be strong. And they were. But then their kids came along and they weren't. And that's what Judges is all about. So we're 150 years past that time. And Israel has cycled a number of different times. And we come now to this story. And really the story is set up in the last few verses of chapter 8, if you'll look at verse 33, it says, as soon as Gideon died, the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping the image of Baal, making Baal Berith their god. Listen, they forgot the Lord their God, who had rescued them from all their enemies surrounding them. Nor did they show any loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, which is Gideon's other name, if you remember, despite all the good he had done for Israel. This is kind of a synopsis, a summary of what takes place in chapter 9. They ditch God, they go after other gods, and they dishonor Gideon's name. So this is kind of a setup for what we're going to see that takes place in chapter 9. So let's jump into it. Verse 1. One day Gideon's son Abimelech went to Shechem to visit his uncles, his mother's brothers. He said to them and to the rest of his mother's family, ask the leading citizens of Shechem whether they want to be ruled by all 70 of Gideon's sons or by one man. And remember that I am your own flesh and blood. So Abimelech's uncles gave his message to all the citizens of Shechem on his behalf. And after listening to his proposal, the people of Shechem decided in favor of Abimelech because he was their relative. They gave him 70 silver coins from the temple of Baal Berith, which he used to hire some reckless troublemakers who agreed to follow him. So let's stop there for a minute. Abimelech, my father is king, decides that dad wasn't going to take the position of king, but I'm ready to take that spot. And so as soon as his dad dies, he sends word through his uncles to the people of this city of Shechem. Listen, you really got 2 choices here. You can either choose to have me be your king. And remember, I'm a part of you because mom is from your city. Or you can let my 70 brothers who aren't a part of you rule over you. So we don't really know what's going on here with the 70 brothers. We don't know if after Gideon died, they decided that they were going to put together some collective kind of authority that they were going to rule over, or if Abimelech was just kind of making this whole thing up so that he could get elected king. We're not really sure what the case was, but whatever it was, the people bought into it, and they said, okay, yeah, easy deal. You're our relative. We'd rather have you be king because we know blood is thicker than water, yeah? And you're going to treat us good. That's basically the idea. And so they give him some money from the foreign god temple, the temple of Baal, and he goes out and he hires an army, mercenaries. Because if you're going to be a king, you got to have an army. And it's always better to get an army that's not your own relatives, right? Because it's easier to boss them around. plus you've paid them. And so that's what's going on here. Verse 5. So he went to his father's home of Ophrah, and there on one stone they killed all 70 of his half-brothers, the sons of Gideon. But the younger brother, Jotham, escaped and hid. So right away, folks, in this story, we begin to see what this guy's like. As soon as the people of Shechem say, yeah, we're going to make you king, he goes back to his father's hometown of Ophrah. He takes his army, he gets his 70 half-brothers, he takes them to this spot, and one by one kills them. Now, what you got to understand is, in this type of a situation, it wasn't just the brothers being killed, but it would be their brothers' entire families. So wives and children were being slaughtered here. This guy is ruthless. And you go, why would he do something like that? Because he didn't want any opposition to his rule. If he gets rid of all his brothers, they would be the opposition. They would be, wait a minute, why is he king? I should be king. I'm going to get my army and attack you and beat you and everything else. And so Abimelech, kind of smart but ruthless, sees ahead and says, man, that ain't going to happen. I'm going to take care of this before there's any of that potential. And he kills all 70 of his half-brothers. It's a bad guy. Verse 7. Then all the leading citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo called a meeting under the oak beside the pillar of Shechem and made Abimelech their king. When Jotham heard about this, he climbed to the top of Mount Gerizim and he shouted, listen to me, citizens of Shechem. Listen to me if you want God to listen to you. So Abimelech kills all 70 brothers. Somehow the youngest brother escapes. Somehow in the bedlam that was going on, in this mass slaughter that was happening, he's able to get away. We don't know how old he was. We don't know anything about him except that he escapes. And then he shows up when he hears that they're going to crown his half-brother Abimelech as king. And he's thinking, obviously, something's got to be done. This is terrible. And so he makes his way to this mountain overlooking where they're doing the coronation. And he stands in a place where he can make sure that everybody's going to hear him. And he shouts out and he says, hey, listen to me. Listen to me. I've got something to tell you, and you need to listen to me, because if you listen to me, it's like listening to God. It's basically what he was saying. And from there, he gives this story. It's a parable, and he uses this parable as a warning. And if you read the parable, what you'll discover is what he says is that the trees got together one day and they decided they wanted a king. And so they went to the olive tree and they said, hey, would you be our king? And the olive tree says, no, I can't be your king. Why should I give up being an olive tree and giving the great things, the produce that I can give to the people and be your king? I'm not going to be your king. So then the next tree that they went to was the fig tree, and the fig tree basically said the same thing. No, I'm not going to be your king. Why should I give up the great things that I do and provide to rule over? And so it goes from there, and he ends up going to the grapevine. And the grapevine says, no, I'm not going to be your king. Why should I be a king? I give wine to people to make them cheerful. Why would I give that up to rule over you? And so finally the trees go to the thorn bush. And they say, would you be our king? And the thorn bush says, sure, I'll be your king. And you can gather yourself underneath my shelter. And if you don't, I'll burn you up. And you look at that and you go, what is going on there? Well, you got to understand, a thorn bush was not a place to get shelter. You didn't get shelter under a thorn bush in that area of the world. There was no shade there. There was no protection. And really what Jotham was saying with this parable is, if you go to Abimelech as a king, it would be as foolish as running to a thorn bush for shelter. The only thing that you're going to get from him is you're going to get burned. It's literally what he's saying. And so this is at the coronation of his brother. He's shouting this thing out. And he concludes his warning by saying this in verse 19. If you have acted honorably and in good faith toward Gideon and his descendants today, then may you find joy in Abimelech, and may he find joy in you. Hey, if you've done the right thing here, if you've honored my dad, and you've done the right thing by him, then good enough. Have fun. But if you have not acted in good faith, then may fire come from Abimelech and devour the leading citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and may fire come out from the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. So he says, look, on the other hand, if you haven't done the right thing, then I hope you burn up and I hope Abimelech burns up. And then you know what he does? You know what Jotham does? He runs away and hides. Because he's basically just pronounced a curse on these guys. In so many words, if you were to take what Jotham said and shrink it down, what Jotham is really saying to the people is this: you are going to harvest what you planted. You better be careful, people of Shechem, because you are going to harvest what you planted. It's basically what he's saying, if you want to narrow it all down. Well, things go pretty good for 3 years. Abimelech's king for 3 years. Everything seems to be going well. But something happens, and that something is called God. God steps in. And in verse 23 it says, God sent a spirit that stirred up trouble between Abimelech and the leading citizens of Shechem, and they revolted. You go, man, what's going on there? Why did God do this? Well, listen to what it says. I'm reading this out of the New American Standard because it's a little bit clearer. It says, so that the violence done to the 70 sons of Gideon might come, and their blood might be laid on Abimelech, their brother, who killed them, and on the men of Shechem, who strengthened his hands to kill his brothers. God stirred up this spirit of dissension among them because of what they had done to Gideon's brothers. And you know what it's basically saying? It's saying that you are now going to harvest what you planted. Oh, it's been a few years, Abimelech. Things are going pretty good. You're in charge. You're the king. Everything seems to be moving in the direction that you wanted it to. But Abimelech, you're about ready to harvest what you planted. So, Abimelech's living in one of the other towns that he's reigning over, and he hears that the people in Shechem aren't happy with him, and that they even set up an ambush for him, and that doesn't work. And so Abimelech knows that things just aren't in a good situation. Meantime, this other character shows up and moves into the city of Shechem. His name is Gaal. And Gaal brings his brothers with him, and somehow he works his way into the good graces of the leaders of the city. And one day they have this harvest festival to their God, and there's a lot of wine flowing, and the people are drunk. And Gaal stands up and he says, hey, who's this guy Abimelech anyway? Why should he be the king of you? You shouldn't let this guy be your king. He's not even totally of you. In fact, you should go back and make the son of one of the people that founded this city your king, not this guy Abimelech. And I got to tell you, if I was the guy in charge, I'd give it to him. In fact, he should just get an army together and let's have it out. Well, Abimelech wasn't there in presence in the city. He was ruling in another city, but he had a sidekick. He had kind of a governor. His name was Zebul. And Zebul heard this, and he gets word back to Abimelech, hey, you better get over here. Things are going south quick, man. And you better bring an army. And listen, bring him at night and set up an ambush, because that's the best way to deal with this thing. And so Abimelech takes his counsel and he does exactly that. He gets his army together. He comes at night. He sets up outside of the city of Shechem. Well, the next morning, here's this guy Gaal who was mouthing off about Abimelech. He's standing there at the city gate, and Zebul, the governor, is there, and he's looking out into the hills, and he goes, I think there's people coming out of the hills. And Zebul says, no, it's just the lighting. It's just the way the sun is starting to come up, and it makes it look like. And he goes, no, there are definitely people up there. And Zebul figured he couldn't snooker him anymore, so he looked at him and he said, okay, big mouth. Check it out, that's pretty much what he says. Okay, big mouth. You said that you were going to take care of Abimelech. Well, why don't you get your guys together and go out and meet him right now? Well, Gaal had to. He had made such a big deal the night before that if he doesn't go out, it makes him look bad. So he gathers his guys together. He goes out to meet Abimelech and his army, and Abimelech and his army kill his soldiers, kick him out of the city, and it's an absolute disaster for this guy Gaal. So the people in the city are figuring, well, our ambush didn't work to get rid of Abimelech. We were kind of hoping this guy Gaal would get rid of him. That obviously didn't work. I guess we're stuck with Abimelech as our king. And so the next morning, the people go out into the fields, the agriculture fields, which would be outside the city walls, and they go out to work, to do their job. Abimelech's not done. This is a man who has vengeance in his heart. He had come and he had set up his men in 3 different directions. And so when the people came out to do their work, 2 of the sections came and began to just slaughter everybody in the fields. While the 3rd group went to the city to block off anybody that was going to try to get back into the city. And they literally just destroyed everybody. They destroyed the city, they wrecked the buildings, and it says they took salt and they threw it all over the ground. And you look at that and you go, what is that all about? Armies would do this. They would take large portions of salt and just dump it everywhere on the fields, because then they couldn't be tilled. They couldn't be used for agriculture. The city would basically be without any means of supporting itself. And so Abimelech doesn't just go in to teach them a lesson. He goes in to wipe them out. Well, about 1,000 people were able to escape, and they escaped to the temple of Baal. And inside the temple, they make their way into this inner area where there's a tower, and they lock themselves inside the tower. Abimelech didn't just go, no big deal, it's just 1,000 of them. He has all his men cut down branches, take them to the temple, surround the temple and the tower with these branches, and he lit them on fire. And he killed all 1,000 people that were inside that tower. This is a guy who's got vengeance on his heart. Well, he's not done. He makes his way about 5 miles away to the town of Thebez, which obviously they were somehow involved in this rebellion. And so he makes his way to that town with his army, and he begins to do the same thing to them that he did to the people of Shechem. These people had a little bit more notice, though, and they ran to their tower, and they barricaded themselves in their tower. And Abimelech's like, shoot, so I'll do the same thing to you that I did to those guys there. And so he gets branches, and he has his army gets branches, and they put it all around. And he goes to light the fire himself, and he gets a little too close to the wall. And a woman on the top of the tower takes a millstone that weighed somewhere between 5 and 10 pounds and drops it on his head. Cracks his skull. And this is what we read in verse 54. He quickly said to his young armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me. Don't let it be said that a woman killed Abimelech." So the young man ran him through with his sword, and he died. When Abimelech's men saw that he was dead, they disbanded and returned to their homes. And that is the story of Abimelech. I don't want it to be known that a woman killed me. And what are we reading today? A woman killed him. Didn't go too good for poor Abimelech. Abimelech was a guy, man, this guy he was power hungry. He was vengeful. He was a murderer. Where did he get all this stuff? How did this happen? How did this guy get so bad? And how did the people want to follow this guy? What on earth? How did this get to this point? And there's a lot that we could pull out of here, folks. Believe me, this was very difficult to kind of say, okay, we got to zero in on one thing because there's so much here that we could park on. But I just want to give you 2 warnings from this story this morning that deal with the principle of harvesting and planting. And here's number 1. So you guys that are on the slides, you went to sleep. Here's number 1. You ready? Be careful what you're planting in the soil of your children. Gideon's personal story ends at the end of chapter 8, but his story through his children continued until they were dead and gone. Gideon was used by God to conquer the enemy. He became this man of faith, at least for a little bit of time. But then what we saw is he digressed from being this strong man of faith, and something happened. He could have been a strong man of faith throughout his life, but he didn't. He got wrapped up in himself. He became vindictive. Ooh, sound familiar? He became prideful. He became greedy. His lifestyle obviously impacted his children, because Abimelech ends up being more vindictive, more prideful, more harsh than Gideon had ever been. See, it's the same for those of us that have children. Our lives are a story, and one day our personal lives, our personal story will end. Our story, at least in this life, will end when we die. But we are writing into the story of our children. And so in a way, our story continues on in them based on what we plant in them. There's three things, at least, that we plant, three types of seeds that we plant in our kids. One is this: intentional seeds. Intentional seeds are those things that we want to make sure that they get, that we implant in them. So it might be things like family tradition, right? We have these traditions that we do as family, and I want to make sure those things are passed on to my children. It might be things like some of you have family crests. You know, you've tattooed them on your body somewhere, or you have it in a picture frame, or it's stitched on something, and it's this family crest, and it kind of tells the story of your family, and that's good. You want to pass that on. You want your kids to understand that because it's rich, and it's about your family heritage, and you want to pass that stuff on. So that's intentional seeds. But for you and I as followers of Christ, there are intentional seeds from this book that we need to be planting in our children. And if we don't, who will? You go, oh, that's why I send them Awana. That's why they go to your Bible study on Tuesday night. That's supplement, folks. That is supplement. It's supposed to be coming from you. Amen. You are to be the main spiritual planter in your children's lives. And I know for some of you go, well, it's too late now. No, I don't have any kids. You got grandkids. Make sure it's happening. Amen. Make sure that you are intentionally planting those seeds of truth from God's Word and watching your children grow and blossom as a result. A second kind of seed that you plant is unintentional seeds. Say unintentional seeds? Yeah, you don't specifically say, well, I'm going to make sure that they know this. I'm going to make sure that this is part of who they are. See, you know, we pass on unintentional things like hair color, eye color, stature, mannerisms. Those are unintentional. We don't program those into our kids ourselves. Those are unintentional. But we also pass on things unintentionally like bad habits, propensities towards certain kinds of sin. See, I don't know about your family, but in my family, one of the propensities towards a certain kind of sin is alcoholism. It runs rampant in my family. I have cousins and uncles and aunts, alcoholics, died alcoholics. And it always has puzzled me because I know some of them watched their parents come home totally wasted on alcohol. and literally physically beat each other. And you would think that that would be enough to deter you from going into that lifestyle. But they picked up the same lifestyle. And it's a propensity in my family. That's why my dad, when I was growing up, some of you have heard this, my dad would tell me, Randy, don't drink. And he didn't tell me, don't drink because you're not going to like it. Don't drink because it tastes nasty. You'll never like it. Don't do it. He'd tell me this, don't drink because you're going to like it. And you're probably going to like it too much. And then he'd start naming uncles and cousins and aunties. And he said they liked it too much. And now look at their life. And there's a good chance that you have that propensity too. And if you don't ever drink, then you'll never take that risk. But see, there's these unintentional things that we'll pass on if we're not careful. It's amazing to me how the unintentional seed seems to grow better than the intentional seed. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Let me go back to where I opened this morning. That garden that we started, man, that was hard work to get that stuff to grow. Keep the bugs and the animals and everything else out of it. Hard work. And then something ridiculous like this happens. We go out one day and we look beside our back steps and I'm going, that looks like a tomato plant. And I bend down and I look. It is a tomato plant. How on earth? And then I went in, I said, Louise, there's tomatoes growing by our back steps. She goes, oh, wow, that's crazy. I threw a rotten tomato out there a couple of weeks ago. It must have taken seed. And you know that crazy thing actually had tomatoes on it a few weeks later? And I'm going, why did I knock myself out a few years ago when I could have just thrown a rotten tomato out and everything would have been great? That unintentional seed took off better than the intentional stuff. And can I tell you something? There's a principle there for us. The unintentional stuff in your life will have a tendency to take root deeper and longer than the intentional stuff you're trying to put into your kids. So you better watch out. You better watch out. The habits that you think that you're hiding, the things that you do that you think, oh, no, they're not picking up on this. Oh, man, let me tell you something about kids. They're smart buggers. Amen. A lot smarter than you and I give them credit for. A story is told about a frail, elderly man. He went to live with his son and daughter-in-law and their 4-year-old grandson. And the old man's hands trembled and his eyesight was blurry and he had a hard time with his balance. Each evening the family would gather around the table and they would have dinner together. Well, because of the old man's condition, he normally made a mess. The peas would roll off his spoon, he would grab his cup and end up spilling, and it became a chore. And one day the son and the daughter-in-law got talking and they said, you know, we got to do something. This is ridiculous. Every night it's the same thing. We got to keep cleaning up after him. This is just, there's got to be a better way. And so they decided what they would do is they would take a little table and they would set it off in the corner and that would be his spot to have dinner by himself where he could make his mess and do his own thing. And because he had broken a number of plates because of the problem holding things together, they gave him a wooden bowl to eat his food out of. And so every night the family would gather and they would place Grandpa in his corner with his wooden bowl. And the only time that they would ever speak to him is to reprimand him because he dropped something or spilled something. Periodically they would look over just to check on him, and on occasion you could see a tear coming out of his eye. Well, this happened night after night, and night after night their 4-year-old son watched what was happening right before him. Well, one night the dad came in and he saw his little boy on the floor and he was playing with some wooden blocks and some Scotch tape. and he was trying to tape them together. And then Dad was curious, and he says, son, what are you doing? What are you making? And he said, oh, I'm making a little bowl for you and Mama to eat your food out of when I grow up.
Amen.
See, folks, the unintentional seed is what we need to really be careful about. Because if we're not careful, those are the things that will grow deeper and last longer in the lives of our kids. Hey, I'm sure there was stuff that Gideon was doing. I mean, he had 70 sons, for crying out. Can you imagine that? I've got 3. And that's hard enough. He had 70. How do you deal? And then stop and think about this. That means he had a lot of wives. We don't know how many. He must have been nuts. I don't get it. He was doing things that I'm sure that he never thought, you know. But the things that he did want to pass on were kind of crazy. If you remember his story, remember? He gets the 2 kings of Midian, and he's ready to kill him, and he looks at his son, and he says, okay, you do it. And we talked about why he would do that. Why would he have his son kill these guys? And it was to disgrace these kings. They would always be known as the 2 kings that were killed by a boy. And it was also to bolster his family name. Yeah, my sons are so good that they kill kings. And so that's the kind of stuff that Gideon was wanting to pass on. Those were the intentional seeds. But what was happening was there was unintentional seeds that were being planted in this kid Abimelech that Gideon probably had no clue of, because he was so self-focused. And folks, you better be careful, because there will come a day of harvest in your children, and what you're planting in them now will come out. And so dads, you better be careful the way you're treating your wife. Because if you are treating her with dishonor and disrespect, then don't be surprised that that's going to show up in your son when he grows up and he treats women maybe and perhaps even worse than you did. Because you would never hit a woman. You'd only yell at her. But he goes beyond the yelling and actually hits. Wives, you better be careful. Mom, you better be careful what you say and how you treat the man in the house. You treat him with dishonor, you treat him like he's an idiot, don't be surprised that your girl grows up and doesn't want to get married to a guy because dad was such an idiot. I mean, we all knew it. He couldn't do anything right. You better be careful, because the unintentional seeds will one day harvest. Folks, listen, we are seeing it all around us, aren't we?
Yes.
We look at our kids and we go, man, why are these kids, what's going on? Look at mom and dad. And look at mom and dad's mom and dad. We're about in the 3rd, sometimes 4th generation of harvest right now. And you go, are we doomed? No, we're not doomed. We'll get there in a minute. Well, here's the last seed, at least the last one for this morning anyway. You plant intentional seed, unintentional seed, and you plant eternal seeds. The greatest thing that you and I can pass on to our kids is a love for Jesus.
Amen.
Your goal should be that you see your kids come to a point where they profess Jesus as their Lord and say, it's not mom and dad's church. It's not mom and dad's faith. They come to a point where they say, this is what I believe. This is what I've done in my life. So many people want to leave their kids an inheritance and stuff, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with wanting to leave your kids better off than you were when your parents left. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not the greatest thing. The greatest thing that you can hand off to them is a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's why last week was so exciting for me. A whole family saying, we are not ashamed. Those girls were following mom and dad saying, yeah, together, right? And then they had a chance to see mom and dad say, you know what? We haven't been doing it right all these years, but we want to do it right now.
Amen.
Isn't that great? You passed on, you guys, some amazing unintentional seed last week. Just know that.
Amen.
Listen to what Paul says. Man, this is so good. He's talking to a group of adults. This is a church. But he considers them his children because they've come to faith because of his ministry. And listen to what he says. This is 1 Thessalonians 2. He says, after all, what gives us hope and joy? And what will be our proud reward and crown as we stand before our Lord Jesus when he returns? Paul says, look, let me ask you, what do you guys think when we stand before Jesus someday? What do you think is going to be our great reward? What do you think is going to be the thing that really makes us joyful? And listen to what he says. It's you. Yes, you are our pride and joy. He was looking at these believers and he was saying, guess what? The greatest thing is when we get to heaven someday and we get to see you there with us. And we're going to say, praise God, it was all worth it. Folks, that's a man speaking to people that he birthed, so to speak, in the Spirit, right? He helped them find Jesus. How much more true is that as parents and grandparents if we can lead our kids and our grandkids to Jesus and one day see them in heaven and say, praise God. Hey, I wasn't rich and I couldn't pass on a whole lot and I didn't have a whole lot of, great intelligent things to leave them and wisdom, but I passed on a faith and they grabbed it and they're here for eternity because I passed on that eternal seed. Folks, that didn't happen with Abimelech. It didn't happen. He picked up all the bad stuff from his dad, Gideon. Somehow he missed the faith. You never see Abimelech mention God. Read the chapter. Never mentions God. Never admonishes God. The only thing we see him doing that's even remotely religious is when they say in Shechem, we're going to make you king. They get 70 pieces of silver from the temple of Baal and they give it to him to go out and buy his mercenary soldiers. That's the only close to religious thing we see him doing. And basically in that act, what he was saying is, I don't need God, I'll just do my own thing. Where did he get that? Man, I could go on and on because this is so close to my heart, folks. But we're going to move on. Here's the second thing. Not only be careful what you're planting in your parenting or in your children, be careful what you're planting in the soil of you. See, here's the deal. Even though Abimelech was the fruit of what his father Gideon had planted in him, he wasn't doomed to be the person he turned out to be. You say, poor Abimelech! He had all this junk planted in his soil. And he turned out to be this louse of a guy. Yeah, okay, that's true. But Abimelech had choices to make along the way too. Somewhere along the way, the plow is taken out of the parent's hand and put into the child's hand. And they start plowing their own seed inside of themselves. Somewhere along the way, Abimelech had to come to a place where he said, look, Dad didn't do it quite right. I don't want to do it that way. I'm going to do it the right way. See, in my family, the propensity to sin is alcoholism. But somewhere along the line, somebody said, no more.
Amen.
I'm breaking that chain. And that was my grandfather. My grandfather was an alcoholic for over 45 years of his life. He came to Christ and he got off of alcohol. I never knew my grandfather as an alcoholic. They would tell me stories and the guy I knew didn't match up with the stories that they were telling. I didn't know him that way. It was a totally foreign thing to me when they would tell me, no way, Gramps did that? Yeah, man, he was crazy when he got drunk. But when he came to Jesus, see, my grandfather's father was an alcoholic. He could have said, I'm doomed. I mean, I've done this for 45 years of my life. I don't know anything better. I might as well just keep doing it. But he came to a point where he was set free by Jesus, and he said, it stops here. You're not doomed just because of the seed, the bad seed, whether it was intentional or unintentional, that was sown into your past. At some point, you are responsible. Would you put this down under that star? I am responsible to cultivate my own soil. I am responsible. You cannot continue to use the excuse, well, you don't know my past. You don't know the parents I had. You don't know what I went through. Hey, I love my friend Ken Freeman. Some of you know him. He's been here several times. We're trying to get him here this fall, by the way, to get him into the school. Ken's a great guy. I've known him for years. If you want to hear something really cool, call his cell phone sometime. I will give you his cell phone number, because his voicemail, it's his testimony. You're on there going, come on, get to the beep. But what he does is he gives his testimony on there in about 45 seconds. Ken was the product of an alcoholic mother. He had 9 stepfathers. And in his brief little testimony, he'll tell you on there, if anybody had a reason to be mad at God, I had that reason. But at 18 years old, he came to understand that God loved him and had a better plan for him. And so despite all the bad seed that had been sown into his soil, he decided it stops here. And so there comes a time and a point where you say, hey, I am responsible. I need to look at this thing and decide to do differently. Job 4:8 says this, those who plant trouble and cultivate evil will harvest the same. Boy, does that not sum up Abimelech's life? Those who plant trouble and cultivate evil will harvest the same. Would you put this down? Ultimately, the lesson of Abimelech's story is that you will harvest what you plant when you do things your own way. The ultimate seeds that Abimelech was planting in the soil of his life produced destruction because they were seeds of doing things his own way. And if you don't understand exactly what that is, it's this: godding your own life. Abimelech didn't want God. He didn't seek God. He wasn't after God's guidance. He wasn't after God's protection. He wasn't after anything that had to do with God. Despite the fact that what he had heard from his father Gideon that God did with him in his brief moment of faith, he didn't want it. He decided he was going to God his own life. There's no indication anywhere in this chapter that he ever sought God for anything. It was all about him and what he could get and what he could do. And the bottom line is, folks, is when you and I try to God our own lives, we are planting in the soil of us bad seed. And it will come forth. It will come to a point of harvest. You say, well, I'm kind of doing my own thing right now. I've been doing it for years. Things seem to be going okay. Tell me the last time you planted a garden and the next day you came out and all the vegetables were up, fully loaded, ready to go. It takes weeks. In fact, if you're a kid, my kids, they would go out and look at that soil every day and go, there's nothing growing. And after about a week, because for a little kid, a week is a long time, I think it's dead, Dad. This is dead. There's nothing going to grow. And that's probably why they got disinterested. And so what happens is we're like little kids. And we look at our life and we're doing things our own way, and we maybe initially we're going, okay, when is the foot going to drop? And it doesn't drop. We don't seem to be bearing any consequences. Things seem to be going okay. It's because the seed hasn't germinated yet. It will. For Abimelech, it took 3 years. 3 years he's cruising along as king, had killed his 70 brothers, figured by then everything's cool, I'm king for life. Maybe he was even beginning to prep his son to be the next king. Who knows? But then the chickens came home to roost. So listen. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says this: trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't depend on your own understanding. Seek His will in all you do, and He will show you which path to take. Man, that's so clear. Now we could keep going there, but let's finish up here. Plant the seeds of doing things God's way, and listen, you will have a harvest of life. That's not me saying this, is a scripture. Listen to Galatians 6, 8 through 9. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap or harvest corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we don't grow weary. Man, I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to follow the Lord. I've been trying to put Him first. I've been trying to go to Him with my stuff. And man, it just seems like I keep having more bills to pay and more struggles to deal with, more people that are setting me off. I don't get it. Where is God? He's there. Keep planting. He's promised He's going to give you a harvest, but it isn't going to happen on your timetable. Keep planting the good stuff. Well, I see so-and-so, man, and you don't know what they're doing. Let me tell you what they're doing. They're doing this with this person, and they said this about that person, and they're stealing this, and man, look at them. They're having fun, and everything seems to be going their way. And look at me trying to serve God, and it's just not going right. Why am I doing this? Because you're planting, and they're planting. And you're waiting for the harvest, and they don't really have a clue yet, but the harvest is coming. And can I remind you that the harvest doesn't come sometimes in this life. Abimelech was a guy. He had had seed sown into him, planted into him by his dad. And he was a guy that was planting his own seed once he got to be an adult. Folks, there is so much in this story about harvesting and planting. But in the very least, we can look at these two warnings and say, man, be careful what you plant in the soil of your children. Be careful what you plant in the soil of you. See, ultimately, Abimelech wanted to be his own God. And that will never work. That's the story of Judges. These judges, these rescuers, these saviors, all temporary, all fallible. And what we start seeing from this point on, from Gideon on, is they get even worse in their character. Worse. Not guys that we're going to want to emulate, but God has to use somebody because He's gracious, and He uses even bad guys sometimes because of His grace. See, when we look at this, what we need to see is God's grace over all this, because God does not doom people. Abimelech wasn't doomed. Abimelech had the same opportunities to say, you know what, it stops here. I'm going to do different than Dad did at the end of his life. I'm going to learn from what he did, how God used him against those Midianites. I want to stand tall in faith like that. And see, we have that opportunity to say, God, use me. I want you to do in me what I can't do in myself. I need you, Savior, in me. Would you bow your heads, please, and close your eyes?